The night my doctor said we need to talk about your family history, I almost laughed. I didn't have one. At least that's what I'd believed for 53 years. My name is Theo Marsh. Most people call me Theo. I spent 26 years building a career in civil engineering, infrastructure projects, highway overpasses, water treatment systems across British Columbia and Alberta. I wasn't flashy about it. I drove a reasonable truck, lived in a reasonable house in Kelowna, coached my son's hockey team on weekends. My wife, Vivian Ann Marsh, née Collier, 49 years old, who had worked as a dental hygienist since before we met, used to tell people I was the most reliable man she'd ever known. She said that right up until the moment she wasn't. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday in March. I was in the middle of reviewing load calculations for a municipal bridge contract when my assistant knocked on my office door with a courier envelope. The return address was a law firm in downtown Kelowna. I remember setting down my coffee and thinking, this must be something to do with a property dispute on one of our sites. It wasn't. Vivian had filed 3 days earlier. I didn't know because she'd moved out while I was in Prince George for a site visit. When I came home that Wednesday night, half the furniture was gone, her car wasn't in the driveway, and there was a note on the kitchen counter that said simply, I spoke to a lawyer. Please don't call me tonight. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. I remember the refrigerator humming. I remember the way the late winter light came through the window above the sink and made everything look washed out and thin. I called anyway. She didn't pick up. What followed was 18 months that I don't entirely know how to describe. The engineering firm, a partnership I'd built from 12 employees to 61, became a source of conflict almost immediately. Vivian's lawyer argued that the growth of the company during our marriage was a marital asset. My lawyer told me to stay calm. My lawyer, as it turned out, was not especially good at her job. By the time it was over, Vivian had the house on Lakeview Drive, half of the business valuation paid out in structured installments, the family SUV, and primary custody of our daughter Zoe, who was 17 at the time and had decided very firmly that she blamed me for everything. Our son Elliot, 21, studying kinesiology at UBC in Vancouver, called me the week the settlement was finalized. He said, I don't fully understand what happened, Dad, but I'm not going anywhere. That phone call kept me going for months. Zoe did not call. I should explain something about the marriage, because I've had 2 years now to think about it, and the question I keep coming back to is the same one that still makes me sit with my coffee and stare out the window of my new apartment. What actually went wrong? Vivian didn't accuse me of cheating. She didn't accuse me of drinking or gambling or any of the things that make a clean, clear villain in a divorce story. What she said, in the one conversation we had before lawyers made all further communication impossible, was this: you were never really here, Theo. Not for me, not for us. You were here for the work. You were here for the projects. And I got tired of coming second to a bridge. I thought that was unfair. I still think it was partly unfair. But I've spent enough time since then being honest with myself to admit that it wasn't entirely wrong either. I traveled. I worked late. I missed dinners and recitals and the kind of quiet moments that, I've learned, are actually the whole point. None of that, I think, justifies what she walked away with. Her lawyer was aggressive in a way mine simply wasn't. They argued that certain investments I'd made in the company, money my mother had given me before she died, money I'd always considered separate, were commingled with marital funds. In Canada, the rules around this vary by province, and in British Columbia, the Family Law Act does not automatically exempt gifts from division if they've been mixed with shared assets. My mother's contribution had gone into an account that Vivian and I both used. That was the thread they pulled, and the whole sweater unraveled. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the south end of Kelowna. I kept going to work. I co-own the company now with my 2 remaining partners, but the dynamic had shifted in ways that were hard to ignore. One of them, a man I'd known since university, started copying me out of client emails. By month 8 of the new arrangement, I understood what was happening. I tendered my buyout offer. They accepted faster than they should have. At 53, I was living in a rental apartment, consulting on small projects, coaching nobody's hockey team. I want to be honest about that period. I wasn't dramatic about it. I didn't drink too much or make desperate phone calls. I went for long walks along the lake in the evenings and I listened to podcasts, and I told myself quietly and with great conviction that I was fine. I was not fine. The collapse happened on a Tuesday in January. Not a dramatic collapse, no movie moment falling to the floor. I was at my kitchen table looking at my laptop when I became aware that something was wrong with my vision. The periphery was flickering. Then my chest tightened. Not pain exactly, more like pressure, like someone had placed a hand flat against my sternum and was slowly leaning in. I called 911 myself, which I later found out is not what people in the middle of a cardiac event usually have the presence of mind to do. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my microwave the entire time. Kelowna General Hospital, 2 days of tests. A cardiologist named Dr. Anand Mehta, 57 years old, with a calm, unhurried manner that I found genuinely reassuring. He explained that I had experienced a serious arrhythmic event, not a full heart attack, but the kind of warning the body sends when it's been ignored for too long. On the third day, Dr. Mehta came to my room with a different kind of expression. Not alarming, more considered, like he was choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Marsh," he said, pulling a chair close, "have you ever been evaluated for a hereditary cardiac condition?" I told him what I'd always known. I was adopted. I had no medical history on my biological side. The Marshes, my adoptive parents, both deceased, had been healthy until their 80s. But that was their genetics, not mine. He nodded slowly. "The pattern of this event, combined with some of the markers we're seeing in your blood work, suggests we should look more closely at something called Brugada syndrome. It's hereditary. If we can get any information about your biological family, even partial, it would help us understand your risk profile significantly." He gave me a pamphlet for a genetic counseling service. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that some of his patients had used commercial DNA databases to trace biological relatives, and that the results had sometimes been medically relevant. I'd been sitting on a 23andMe kit for 2 years. My adoptive parents had been private people, and even after their deaths, digging into my biological origins had felt like a betrayal of something I couldn't name. The kit was in a drawer in my home office, now my spare bedroom, still in its plastic wrap. When I got home from the hospital, I opened it. I sent it in on a Thursday. I waited. The results came back on a Wednesday evening 5 weeks later. I was eating leftover butter chicken at my kitchen table when the notification came through. I set down my fork. I opened the app. The first thing I saw, flagged immediately at the top of the DNA relative section, was a match listed as close family, likely half-sibling or grandparent-grandchild. The name on the profile was Rosalind Fehr. I stared at that name for a long time. It meant nothing to me. And yet my hands were doing something strange. Not shaking, exactly, but very still in the way that happens when the body is trying to process something the brain hasn't caught up with yet. I clicked on the profile. Rosalind Fehr from Saskatoon. She had a small profile photo, a woman in her mid-60s, graying hair, glasses with red frames. She had written in her profile bio, "Searching for biological family connections. Please message if you match. On behalf of an estate." I messaged her that night. She responded within 4 hours, which told me she'd been waiting. Her name was Rosalind Fehr, 63 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. She was the executor of the estate of a man named Walter Fehr, who had died 9 months earlier at the age of 78. Walter Fehr, she explained, carefully, over several messages, had been a grain farmer and later a land developer in central Saskatchewan. He had also, for the last 31 years of his life, known that he had a biological son somewhere in British Columbia, given up for adoption in 1971. He had been searching, in one way or another, for most of that time. Rosalind was Walter's niece, his only close surviving relative. He had never married, never had other children. When he died, he left an estate valued at approximately $4.1 million, farmland, a commercial property in Saskatoon, some investment accounts, and he had left a specific clause in his will. Rosalind read it to me over the phone 3 days after our first message. I remember sitting on my couch, not moving, listening to her voice, soft, precise, a little sad. The clause stated that if a biological son, consistent with a DNA profile Walter had submitted to a genetic database in 2019, could be confirmed within 12 months of Walter's death, that son would inherit the entirety of the estate, minus a modest gift to a local agricultural scholarship fund and a sum left to Rosalind herself for her service as executor. Walter had died 9 months ago. "Mr. Marsh," Rosalind said gently, "you have approximately 11 weeks. I didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. "I know this is a great deal to absorb," she said. "Take whatever time you need tonight, but I want you to know, I want you to understand, that my uncle spent a very long time hoping this call would happen. He talked about it often. He used to say he just wanted to know the boy had turned out all right." I had to put the phone down for a moment after that. Here is the part that still sits with me uncomfortably. Even now, I had not reached out to Walter when I could have. 2 years earlier, When I'd first registered my profile on one of the ancestry sites, out of idle curiosity before the medical urgency, I had received a notification about a possible paternal line connection. A partial match, not close enough to flag as apparent, but notable. I'd looked at it briefly, told myself it was probably nothing, and closed the app. The marriage was already fracturing at that point, and I was consumed by it. Walter had been alive then, he had been looking, and I had been too caught up in the wreckage of my own life to look back. I don't have a clean way to feel about that. I've talked about it with a therapist since, and she says the important thing is what I do with the regret, not the regret itself. I'm still working on believing her. The legal process moved quickly once Rosalind connected me with the estate's law firm. A DNA sample, properly administered this time through a certified testing facility, confirmed the biological relationship with a 99.97% probability. Walter Fehr was my biological father. I flew to Saskatoon in April. Rosalind met me at the airport herself, which I hadn't expected. She was smaller in person than I'd imagined, with the kind of face that carries its emotions openly and without apology. She hugged me in the arrivals hall. She smelled like cedar and hand lotion. "He would have been so pleased," she said into my shoulder, and then she collected herself and drove me to see the farm. The Fehr land was outside a small town called Lumsden, about 40 minutes from the city. Rolling prairie, a working farmhouse, outbuildings, a long gravel drive lined on both sides with poplar trees that Walter had planted himself 40 years ago. Rosalind told me he'd planted them the year he started searching. That he'd done it, he said, because he wanted to build something that would still be standing when he finally found his son. I had to stop walking at that point and just stand in the driveway for a minute. She also gave me a letter. Sealed, handwritten, my name Theodore, written on the front in a careful, deliberate script. Walter had written it a year before he died, she said, when it became clear his health was declining and the search had not yet succeeded. She had been holding it. I read it alone that evening in my hotel room. I'm not going to share everything he wrote. Some things are private in a way that doesn't survive being turned into a story. But I will say this. He wrote about the decision to let me go as one he didn't make alone, and one he spent decades carrying. He wrote that he'd thought about me every year on my birthday. He knew the date because it was the one piece of information the adoption agency had given him before closing the file. He wrote that he'd tried to do right by the land he had, and that he hoped I would feel the same freedom with it that he had. He wrote, "I don't know what kind of man you turned out to be, but I spent 30 years hoping you were the kind who could forgive a young man who didn't know what else to do." I sat with that letter for 2 hours. I don't fully know yet if I've forgiven him, but I'm trying, and I think trying counts for something. The inheritance was formalized through the Saskatchewan courts over the following 3 months. The probate process was straightforward. Walter's paperwork was impeccable. Rosalind told me he'd always been meticulous about record keeping, and by July the estate had transferred. The Lumsden farmland, the Saskatoon property, the investment accounts, all of it. What I did not anticipate was the phone call I received from Vivian in August. We had not spoken directly, only through lawyers, for nearly 2 years. So when her name appeared on my phone, I stared at it through 2 full rings before answering. She was pleasant, carefully, deliberately pleasant, in the way she gets when she wants something and is managing her approach. We exchanged a few minutes of small talk. She asked if I was well, said she'd heard I'd been in hospital, said she hoped I was taking care of myself. And then she said she'd been speaking with her lawyer about some aspects of the settlement that she felt hadn't been fully accounted for. "What aspects?" I said. She mentioned the inheritance. I want to be precise here because it matters. Vivian had known me for over 2 decades. She knew I was adopted. She knew I had no contact with my biological family. She had signed a settlement agreement that divided our marital assets, the house, the business valuation, the shared accounts. The inheritance from Walter Fehr was something that did not exist during our marriage. It had arrived after the divorce was finalized, through a biological relationship I'd only confirmed post-separation. I let her finish speaking. Then I told her calmly that I had spoken to a lawyer. Under the British Columbia Family Law Act, an inheritance received after the date of separation is not considered a family asset. The settlement was final. There was nothing to revisit. She called 2 more times over the following week. The 3rd time, I let it go to voicemail. Her tone had shifted by then, less managed, more frustrated. She said she just wanted to have a conversation. She said she felt I was being unfair. I did not call back. About 3 weeks after Vivian's calls stopped, I received a text from Zoe, my daughter, who had not contacted me in close to 18 months. It was a short message. She said she'd heard some things through Elliot, and she wanted to reach out. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She said she hoped we could maybe talk sometime if I was open to it. I read that message several times. I want to be careful about how I characterize this, because Zoe is my daughter and I love her, and whatever complicated thing happened between us during the divorce is not the whole of who she is or who we are to each other. She was 17 when it all fell apart. She was processing a family collapse through the lens of a teenager who had limited access to the full picture. I understand that, and yet, the timing was what it was. Elliot had mentioned in a careful way that Zoe and Vivian had spoken recently, and that Vivian had told her some version of the inheritance story. Whether Zoe had done the math herself or Vivian had done it for her, I don't know. I texted back. I told her I was open to talking. I told her I loved her. And I told her, plainly but without anger, that I wanted us to have a real relationship, the kind built on honesty and effort on both sides, not just proximity to good fortune. She called me that Sunday. It was a long call, awkward in places, emotional in others. She cried twice. I didn't try to talk her out of it. She said some things she'd been holding on to, and some of them were hard to hear, and some of them were fair. I said things I'd been holding on to too. By the end we had something. Not a resolution, not a restoration of what we'd had before, but an opening. A door cracked just enough to let some light through. I don't know yet what it becomes. I'm being careful not to want too much too fast. Elliot came to visit in September. He drove up from Vancouver in the second-hand Civic he'd bought with his own money, pulled into my parking lot with a cooler full of groceries, and cooked dinner in my apartment kitchen while I sat at the island and told him everything. About the hospital, about Walter, about the farm, about all of it. He listened without interrupting, which is a quality in a person that I have learned not to take for granted. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you have a farm now?" "I have a farm," I said. "Do you know anything about farming?" "Absolutely nothing." He grinned, and that felt, in a way that surprised me with its force, like something healing. I've been back to Lumsden twice since April. Rosalind connected me with the couple who leased the working farmland. They've been tenants for 11 years, good people, and they want to continue. The commercial property in Saskatoon is managed by a property firm. I am not about to pretend I've become a prairie farmer overnight, but I have walked those fields in the early morning, when the light is flat and gold and the air smells like grass and clay, and I have stood beside those poplar trees Walter planted 40 years ago, and I have felt something that I can only describe as a delayed inheritance, not just of money, but of a story I was never meant to miss. I hired a better financial planner. I took on a consulting contract I actually feel good about. I started sleeping through the night, which sounds small and isn't. Zoe and I have spoken 4 times since that first Sunday call. Each time it's been a little easier, a little more honest. We're not going to be able to rebuild 20 years of relationship through a few phone calls, and I've stopped pretending we might. But I think we're trying, both of us. And I've decided that has to be enough for now. I had a short correspondence with Dr. Mehta, who had referred me for the genetic counseling that started all of this. I wrote to thank him. He wrote back a brief professional note, but at the end he added, "I hope the results of the testing gave you more than just a medical history, Mr. Marsh. It sounds like they may have. They did. Here is what I know now, at 53, that I did not know 2 years ago. The things that matter do not announce themselves as mattering. I spent 26 years building load-bearing structures, calculating stress tolerances, designing systems to carry weight over time. I was very good at it. And I was not nearly as good at noticing which parts of my actual life were the load-bearing walls. The marriage failed. I don't have a clean answer for who carries how much of that. I know that I was not always present. I know that Vivian made choices I still don't fully understand. I know that the woman who once said I was the most reliable man she'd ever known ended up in a lawyer's office trying to claim money from a man she'd spent 2 years not speaking to, and that tells me something, though I'm not sure it's a comfortable something. My biological father planted trees he never got to sit under with his son. He left a clause in a will because hope, for him, was worth making legally binding. He spent 30 years reaching toward a person who didn't know he was reaching. I think about that a lot. I think about what it costs to keep looking for something when you have no guarantee it's there. And I think about what it means to find it too late, and whether too late is actually a real category, or just a story we tell ourselves to make peace with the gap between what we wanted and what we got. The poplars on the Lumsden property are fully grown now. They're beautiful in the fall, yellow all the way to the top, shaking in the prairie wind like they're trying to say something. I drove out there in October and stood under them for a while. I didn't know what to say back, but I stayed.